tonight's event is part of our Writers Writing series, and really the idea is to bring writers together and talk about their craft.
My question for Maaza is at what point in your life did English become your working language? And did you go to school in an English language school when you were a little girl? And
I had to learn English. I went to, eventually I moved to Nairobi, to Kenya, so it was a British system, and I was learning English there. When I came to the US, my English was okay. It's not the language that I spoke at home. It was the language that in school, but I still had trouble here. And I think that was one of the reasons that I really liked to read when I was growing up here, because there was so much adjustment happening, and I had to learn the language well, and kids make fun of you if you have an accent, and all those things. So I knew it, but British English is very different from the US, and my vocabulary was limited at the time. But I think in English, when I get really mad, my accent comes out. But yeah.
Since they didn't take the microphone, let me ask you a follow-up. Is there a writer or writers in English who are your touchstones, or who are really, Jane Austen, or I don't know. I haven't read your books, so I don't know. Nabokov.
Well, I can go all the way back. I can start with Homer, and I think the world divides up into two groups: those who like the Iliad and those who like the Odyssey. And I love the Iliad. I go back to him again and again.
Whose translation?
Fagel's translation,
Oh, yeah.
Not Lattimore and Fitzgerald.
Right.
Little, yeah. So I go back to him. That just the control of language, but the energy behind that. I do. I've had my students are here. E.L. Doctorow, as they will know. Edith Wharton. I have read. There's just so many. Ama Ata Aidu, who's a Ghanaian writer, just blew my mind when I was first really reading seriously. Tons of Hilary Mantel, as they know. Again, I make them read all the books I like. But yeah, it's a spectrum.
My question is, I think mostly for Maaza, but if you want to jump in, that's great too. I was struck at the beginning by how sort of the contrast in your personal relationship to your subject matter, and I'm wondering, kind of, for you, it's a very personal story on someone that you're trying to unearth, and for you, it was something that you kind of sought out that you didn't have growing up. And I'm wondering, because it was so personal for you, how you think that sort of played into your writing process. I can imagine it's sort of a liability, but also a benefit. And I don't know if you could contrast that if you've written things that are sort of less personal or more personal, and how that's different as a writer, if that.
I think one of the ways I can answer this, it was, I didn't think that I thought that I had enough distance from the subject matter and enough time away from the memories to kind of just dig in and write. And when I moved to New York, I was living in Los Angeles, and I packed what I could in a friend's car, drove here. I didn't have a desk. So when I was starting to write this story, I would go to a cafe, and I completely lost it. I would sit in there and I would lose it. I would start crying in the middle of certain scenes, and most people would back away from me when I was sitting there, and the people behind the counter would give me free coffee, and I said, I can't do this. I actually have to figure out a way. I can't be in public, I realized, because there's certain scenes are really difficult in here to read, and they were just as difficult to write. So I had to get a desk at some point, and I wrote it home. But the second book, it's not memory, it's 1935. And the history, though it is violent, is not as tragic. And I have an emotional distance, but what that means is I have to actually work harder to know my characters, because I have to get to that point where I feel so close to them, like I did here. And so that, for me, it's a continual process of kind of unearthing who these characters are. I will have to say, though, that the challenge with them and emotional closeness to characters is that I had to be close to all of them in this book, including the torturers. And I had to get in their skin as much as I was getting into the people that they were interrogating. So that kind of emotional proximity, it can be difficult at times too.
And I'll just add, I'm not a historian or an academic. I think there are benefits. You're always supposed to write what you know. That's what you're told. I think there are real benefits to writing what you don't know. I think sometimes academics and historians will tackle a subject like this and they'll assume you know things, so they won't explain them in a sort of passionate way because they've probably explained it 50 million times. And so some of this stuff was so new to me that I just felt passionate about describing it in a paragraph, what was happening in this thing. And I think, Maaza, you're a photographer. Like, you go to a new city.
He's a photographer.
I'm a photographer too, but we're both photographers. But there's benefits, like if you go out and photograph New York City, you've been in New York City a long time. It's different. Go to a new city, everything looks fresh and different, and you're sort of inspired. Like go look at the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building. You're not going to see a lot of New Yorkers taking those pictures.
Right.
But people from other countries who've never seen it, it's spectacular to look at. And they're finding new angles, new ways to shoot it. And I think that's sort of the way approaching these kind of stories, everything's new to you. And you want to bring that kind of energy where you're explaining to the reader, like right across from you, like almost like your husband or wife. You wouldn't believe what I learned today. So Thurgood Marshall gets on this train, he goes down there, and guess what happened? You want that kind of enthusiasm, and you also have the context of what you're describing instead of saying, oh, of course, you're talking about Jim Crow. Everybody knows about Jim Crow. There's a lot of things people don't know about Jim Crow. And you want to have people be able to turn those pages and learn about this as if they're learning it for the first time.
Yeah, and I think that's where the research, I think the research comes in, because if you dig into anything you think you know, if you dig into it enough, there are some things you don't know, and you can often grab from that and then develop something brand new.
Right.
I think, yeah.
And that's another thing, just to get back to it, like the trial. Everyone has expectations about how trials are supposed to go. Of course, you can't hide evidence. The judge can't keep overruling. That doesn't make any sense. That's an objection. That's going to be overturned. And when you start realizing you're learning about a different legal system where the Bill of Rights is not incorporated into American Constitution, I mean, this is just some of these things that you're seeing happening in a trial. They're happening because a judge allows them. And if you don't have the money to appeal these things, that's it. That's the final say. And so it's a different justice system than we're used to looking at. And as a non-lawyer, I found that absolutely fascinating. So,
can I ask Gil something?
Sure.
What was it like being in the South and doing some of this research and trying to contact some of these people?
Yeah, it's funny, and a lot of times it seems like it's ancient history. It's 60 years ago. There are people who are still alive in this case. The girl whose accusation started this, she was 17 at the time. She's still alive. And that was one of the problems I had because, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a provocative guy. I didn't want to be like Geraldo Rivera and show up on a doorstep. On the other hand, that's the great thing about writing history. You're dealing mostly with dead people. But when some people are still alive and you're telling their story, you feel sort of obligated. Well, I should let them know what I'm working on. Maybe 60 years have gone by. Maybe they want to talk. And that was the case with the young woman, Norma Paget. She was 17 years old at the time. She's still alive. And I was able to track her down. She was living in the woods in a little trailer in Georgia. And it was the thing I put off to the last possible moment because I was absolutely mortified. But I felt I owed it to the people who read the book, myself, and also to her to sort of get that story out there and see if she wanted to make a comment. And I remember I flew down to Atlanta, I rented a car, and I drove onto these clay roads in the backwoods of rural Georgia, and I couldn't make that turn into her driveway because I was just so scared. And finally, it was just like being a kid on a diving board. I just turned down there and started driving down there, and now there's no turning back. And dogs are running alongside of me, barking, and I'm getting deeper and deeper into the woods. And, originally I thought maybe if she lives in town, she'll tell me to go away, be thousands of witnesses around. It wasn't like that. And so I arrived and I knock on the trailer. This old man comes out and I explain what I'm doing and what I want to do. And he says, I don't think she's going to want to talk, but we can try. And I went over there, and now this person I've been writing about for 4 years, I see her eyes peek through like the little blinds of a trailer, and it, it sent a chill down my spine. And, I said, I'm not here to ask personal questions. I really telling you about the book I'm writing, and do you want to talk about growing up in this time and anything you're comfortable saying? And we went back and forth a couple times, and basically she just said, let sleeping dogs lie. That was her quote to me. And she didn't want to talk about it. And I think she is scared that she can be arrested because people died after her accusations. And I think she was threatened by the sheriff and the prosecutor that if you talk to anybody, you can go to jail. And so she hasn't talked in 60 years. Wow. Yeah, it's really strange.
There is this moment in the book, though, where there's a petition against capital punishment, and her name is on it.
Right.
And so there's this moment of, maybe there's something has happened for her and something has changed for her.
Right. And it's that was sort of the way it was going. And she signs this petition to basically say that she's against capital punishment, which the defense uses to lay on the governors when they're trying to get a pardon towards the end. And you think maybe she's had a change of heart. Maybe she recognizes this. Maybe she recognizes that, 4 people have been killed because of what she said. But then, within a few weeks later, the sheriff is using her again, and she's out there assaulting these people with really vicious words. And so I don't know if she's ever personally reconciled it herself, but it's a pretty painful chapter. And I always, just so you know, I never really thought that a 17-year-old girl was capable of doing all this destruction on her own. At some point, she makes these accusations, and the story's no longer hers. It becomes the sheriff's, the prosecutors, and she sort of has to go along with that. She has to testify. She has to give statements. So I could never really blame a 17-year-old for setting this up. I think it was really the men in her life who really steered her wrong, including her father. So,
in 2009, I was in Egypt right after Obama gave his speech, and every Egyptian I met was very impressed with America internationally. It was like we had changed after that there had been this great sea change in us just by the election of this guy, just as his the physical fact of him meant that we changed. And when I had to go back again a couple of years later, right before the 2012 election, and that attitude was completely changed, And I guess what I'm asking you, the comment you read about the Soviet prime minister saying that thing about America struck me over the weekend, how John Kerry was going around talking about how you just don't go because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He's like, you don't invade another country on some trumped up pretext, And I feel like we're always struggling with, as Americans, we want to exude this idea that we have some sort of moral center, yet the evidence that we see in front of us is constantly to the contrary of it. It's like obviously it's not Jim Crow, but we seem to have a Supreme Court and at least half of Congress that completely wants to undo the 20th century and all the progresses that we've made. So I guess the only question, if I have a question that I'm trying to get at, is like, talk me off the ledge. Is there real? Do you see palpable progress? Do you really feel like we have a prison population that overwhelmingly imprisons African Americans, and it's for profit now,
right,
for the most part. So there's incentive to keep the populations high. So I'm just curious about the changes that you see, like the real changes that you feel.
I mean, I'll just say briefly that, they call that the new Jim Crow, the prison system. I think, this country is basically, we went to war over race, basically. And it's who we are as an America. And I think if you look at, I still find this interesting, it's always bubbling under the surface. So you look at President Obama, who won 2 elections. I wouldn't say they were landslides, but they were pretty close. He won electorally pretty handily. And yet, if you look at his numbers and go back and look at Kerry and Gore, even though they lost, got much higher percentage of white votes in the South. And so what is that about? Here we were as a country electing a Democratic president in 2008 and 2012 by a pretty significant margin. And yet whites in the South, his numbers dropped. I mean, he should have been more popular. He was more popular in the rest of America, and yet in the South, John McCain got a lot more votes, and in these kind of numbers. And to me, how else can you attribute that to race? And you look at some of the laws that are being signed into legislation. You look at Arizona. I think if you look at voting rights, that was something we thought we settled in the 40s and then again in the 60s. And here we are. The Supreme Court says race is no longer an issue in the South. We don't need to keep punishing these states. And immediately, within hours, you see a couple states make a run towards new legislation that makes it more difficult for disenfranchised people to vote. And that can only be about race, in my opinion.
When I read Gil's book, and I am a lawyer, and I was a prosecutor here in the New York District Attorney's Office. When I read your book, it was right when the Trayvon Martin case was coming out. I'm in the category of I thought I knew. I thought I knew what Jim Crow was. I thought I knew, and I knew I wasn't a scholar or an expert, but your book was so powerfully a description of all of that. And it was sort of a page turner. I even asked myself whether, I don't know if the word is salacious. I said, Mike, I couldn't put it down. I said, can this be? Right. Can these courtroom scenes be where every right ever known to, doesn't matter what country, anywhere, was totally thrown out the window. Right. But because I read that book with the Trayvon Martin case as a sort of background, and I've also been reading Jane Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which I think, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and there's another one that's come out called Reproducing Racism. I think that in many ways in the whole Obama discussion, your book helped me realize actually how far we haven't come, how really deeply, deeply entrenched in the American psyche and experience our racism is. Right. So that was one of the things that really spoke to me about your book. And for me personally, it sort of fit in with these other things that I was reading. So it both I was shocked at how bad that was, and I didn't know about the penury system, but it also really helped me realize that where we are is still deeply entrenched in this. I feel I don't think that having elected Obama is anywhere near what we need to go through.
I think that's an excellent comment, and I think that's one of the things that, and Maaza writes about this. You want to sort of describe these things in human moments, because to talk about laws can be kind of dull after a while. But I remember people have talked to me, like one of the moments in the book where this young man has been shot by the side of the road and he's in critical condition, and his parents basically hitchhike to the jail so that they can visit their son because they're told he's about to die. He's in critical condition. And it turns out the deputy and the sheriff they want him to die because they don't want him telling a story of what happened on that road. And so the deputy just basically stands in front of the room and says, "You need a court order to visit your son." And he just makes up the law. And yet the parents are just like, "Oh, that's the law because a white person told me that's the law." And they just walk outside the hospital and they talk to a reporter, and they're just scared for their lives. They said, should we move? Are they going to kill our family next? And I think it was those sort of human moments, like that's the way people were thinking back then. Mm-hmm. Like it didn't matter. You couldn't go to the hospital officials and say, "That deputy just told me I can't see my son." That would be something you could do today. Back then, there was no chance of that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's when you start recognizing that it didn't matter what the law was. It mattered what you were told and what your expectations and how far you were willing to bow and stand and get in line behind what white authority was. And so it's those moments that sort of speak to you rather than the laws. Mm-hmm.